All right, guys. So welcome to this fireside chat on the road to Civil War itself, and Reconstruction. So the first thing we're going to do is consider this question: evaluate the relative importance of factors that contributed to growing sectional tension in America between 1820 and 1861. The College Board loves these sort of open-ended and very broad questions because it allows them greater access to source base, but then allows you to put in the things that you know and greater opportunity for outside information. Okay, so this is going to be the bulk of our presentation today, seeing how we would tackle this question. And so here are some possible answers to that question, just without any sort of stimulus or documents. Let's just talk about what things come to mind. Obviously, the increasing debates over slavery, the development of different cultures in the North and the South, and somewhat the West, differing or contradicting economic systems. You have to use the word contradicting there because the two cannot, for a long period of time, coexist together. Wage labor and slavery they pull opposite to one another, but that's the topic for a different day. Competing views on the political system. In this, we mean basically size of government, and or should states have more power, or should the federal government have more power. There's debates surrounding westward expansion, whether we should do that and what the purposes of it would be. There's demographic differences. This one I'm not going to cover in much depth, so let's take a minute to talk about it now. In the North, because of the market revolution, you see an increasing influx of immigrants, particularly from the potato famine ravaged Ireland, but then also the political upheaval in Germany, and they tend to settle in the Northeast and Midwest. Not a lot of immigrants go to the South because there's not really a lot of opportunity there for them to make it, seeing as though slave labor kind of runs the day. Nevertheless, as a result of this, you see large cities take off, and because of that, you have an urban population in the North and you have a rural one in the South. And then finally, views on the American system or internal improvements, which you could very easily wrap up into the competing views on political systems. But since the tariff is such a big deal, we'll go ahead and give it its own little highlight there. So here we have several different things, 7 to be exact, of opportunities that you could organize an essay around what factors led to increasing sectional tensions. And then I would ideally rank these and talk about either the most important 2 or most important 3, based of course on what the documents give me. Okay, so with that said, as we go through the different events that led up to the Civil War, hopefully you're keeping in your mind this list, or you have it written down on paper now, that you can categorize all of the different events into. Now, one thing that's important before we go on, you could make a legitimate case that all of these, every single one of them, after the first one, can be brought back to slavery, which is why if you come across somebody who just says, oh, that's Civil War, it was only because of the fact that they had differing economic systems. Yeah, they had differing economic systems. One was based on free labor industrial capitalism, and the other one was based on agrarian slavery. Different political systems, yeah, the right to own slaves, and so on and so on. So everything can be brought back to slavery. I don't think that's news to anybody at this point, but just want to make the point that if we're going to be complex about this, if we're going to try and make a nuanced argument, then we have to at least understand where other people are coming from. Okay, so let's get things started. The time parameters here are 1820 to 1861. Obviously, 1820, our beginning is with the Missouri Compromise. So what I'll do with each of these events is I'll give you some sort of context that hopefully triggers some information that you had learned at some point this year, what went into the conflict, and then how I would suggest categorizing it, or in what paragraph of a hypothetical essay I think it might go. So we have the Missouri Compromise, which in 1820, because of increased westward expansion spurred mostly by the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, it leads to people moving westward. And then in addition with that, you have agricultural innovations that allow for the opening up of more dry, hard dirt land in the West. So as a result, Missouri wants to become a state, but they want to become a slave state. And that makes people in the North kind of uneasy, because if Missouri is admitted as a slave state, it will offset the balance in the Senate. And since the Senate is the senior governing body of America, the House, of course, has the power of the purse. They control a lot of the money decisions, but the Senate is really where crucial decisions are made. They don't want the Senate to be dominated by slaveholding states, because then they would have a mandate to protect slavery even more than they already were. So they strike a deal, and Henry Clay is the architect of the deal, dubbed the Great Compromiser, which brings Missouri in as a slave state, but then offsets the balance in the Senate by bringing in Maine as a free state. Now, this, of course, doesn't solve the root cause of everything, the debate over whether slavery should expand. Had they have stopped the expansion of slavery here, slavery may have died out on its own. And that's why Thomas Jefferson, a pro-slavery, slave-holding Southern politician, is so angry about the Missouri Compromise, is because he wants slavery to just die out on its own. But the further you expand it, the more life it gets, and it'll just sort of keep going and going. So we have two issues at heart here: slavery and expansion, because really, what are we going to do as we continue to expand? Now, the Missouri Compromise tries to speak to that by saying, well, let's just not allow slavery north of this 3630 line, but we'll allow it in the Arkansas territory, but that is it. When the Missouri Compromise is passed, there's nobody that is able to see into the future long enough to recognize that America is going to get all this blue land too. So really, the complications are, they just did not do a very good job of foreshadowing. Okay, but nevertheless, the Missouri Compromise, an attempt to make things okay, but really all it does is it kicks the problem down the line a little bit further and further. Okay, and now if that's not a scary picture, I don't know what is. In 1832, we have the Nullification Crisis. So the context of this one is, obviously, as the market revolution was ramping up into full swing, people who were making textiles in the North wanted some sort of protections around their domestic business ventures. And one of those protections is against cheap English cloth. If you can make English cloth more expensive, then all of a sudden Americans will have an incentive to buy American-made products. So government slaps a tariff on English cloth, which makes people in the South really, really mad. This conflict comes mostly because of this differing system of economies. An industrializing economy in the North will want protective tariffs. An agrarian and draconian old school agricultural economy in the South will not. And therefore, things come to a boiling point, and John C. Calhoun writes a famous document called the Ordinance of Nullification, where he basically calls upon the states and says, if the federal government makes a law that you don't like, you are perfectly within your right as a state to nullify it. Jackson obviously responds to this quite harshly. He says he's going to go hang John C. Calhoun from a tree. He uses the military to force South Carolina to pay the federal tariff, which South Carolina does because they are cowards. And nevertheless, though, you have this crisis brewing, but the real solution is not solved. The differing economic systems that brought this to a boiling point are not reconciled at this point. The issue is just sort of kicked down the line a little bit. Categorization, definitely economics and political systems, and also the American system or internal improvements. Fast forward to, this is kind of a vague one. It doesn't necessarily have a year, but the growing presence of the abolition movement is something that increases sectional tension. So hopefully you recall that alongside the market revolution, there was also a change in society. The Second Great Awakening sort of gave a shot of adrenaline into American religious feelings. But this one was different than the First Great Awakening. This one argued that you change society through good individual works. And this caused a lot of people to turn to slavery as an opportunity. And they saw, okay, I can get my salvation through taking part in the abolition movement. So the Second Great Awakening is spurring this. Now, abolitionists, as time goes on, grow more and more antagonistic in their rhetoric and their behavior. Namely, William Lloyd Garrison, the publisher of the famous anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, is famous for burning the Constitution, saying that it's a deal with the devil because it condones slavery, and so on. When you bring the rhetoric there and you're sort of almost implicating individuals that own slaves, it's going to get increasingly uncomfortable for them to hear that. And as a result, the South is sort of put on high alert as a result of this growing abolition movement. Anyways, this one is most clearly debates over slavery. Fast forward into the 1840s, and we have the Mexican-American War. Context, of course, is manifestiny, or the idea that it is America's God-given right to control all the land from sea to shining sea. And in an effort to fulfill their manifest destiny, they sort of create a war with Mexico in which they absolutely curb stomp the Mexicans and win a very efficient conflict. Now, Northerners were on this one from the very beginning. They knew that the war was an opportunity to expand territory, which would then lead to an expansion of slavery. But even before the war was over, Northerners had already pinpointed that possibility, and most famously, a Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot in 1856 decides that he's going to try and put a lid on expanding slavery, and he offers up into Congress the Wilmot Proviso. It doesn't pass, but it does create angst in the South, who now see their institution of slavery being on direct attack from the Northerners. Now, it's worth reminding you that David Wilmot was no egalitarian friend of Black Americans. He was as racist as they came. He wanted that land open to white workers and white workers only. So free labor in the West, because then poor whites from the East would be able to move out there. So not all anti-slavery people were necessarily, that woke. Anyways, this one has to do with expansion and what's going to happen when we do expand. What will the land be made into? And of course, that question always comes back to, is it going to be a slave territory or not? Okay, so stemming almost directly from that one is the Compromise of 1850, because in 1848, there's still no perfect decision as to what to do with the territory that we gained from Mexico. And then when California gets enough people in it because of the gold rush, all of a sudden they want statehood. Well, now we have a problem, because if you let in one state, California, what are we going to do? Because at this point, still in 1850, a balance had been kept. So there's this ongoing debate over slavery in the territories. California wants statehood, but it would throw the balance in the Senate off. So Henry Clay, resurrected from the dead, comes back and makes another compromise. Let California in as a free state, which means the balance will be offset, but promise the South that the North will not come after their slaves. And if they do, Southerners can go north and reclaim their property. Now, this, of course, leads to a whole bunch of shenanigans, both on the side of the South and the North. People from the South will go to the North, find a free Black person and say, hey, that's my slave. And then when the person says, no, I'm not a slave, this person from the South says, oh, show me your papers. And then they don't have any, and therefore sort of stuck, because the Black person is they're having to give the burden of proof. But people in the North are not cooperating, because there are slaves that do escape. And when they come north, they are harbored by Northerners, and the Southerners figure this out. And so it's just kind of a mess on all sides. Now, this one, you can obviously categorize into slavery and expansion, but it's important to make note here that if you have a compromise in 1850 and you're having another compromise, or you had another compromise in 1820, the whole compromise thing is not really working. We've been trying these compromises. The Nullification Crisis was kind of a compromise. Compromise of 1850 is a compromise. It just, as time is going on, you can only compromise so much without solving the underlying problem before things will come to catastrophic proportions. So obviously, and this is something that the College Board focuses on a lot, they like to talk about the failure of compromise. So keep that one in the back of your mind. And if you have a chance to read the curriculum framework on these periods, you'll know that that's one of the topics that they talk about. Okay, so shortly after the Compromise of 1850, we get Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe because she was so mad about the Compromise of 1850. Now, she is also a spawn of the Second Great Awakening, her dad being one of the most influential Second Great Awakening preachers. So there is this religious abolitionist undertones to her work, but she's mostly furious about the new Fugitive Slave Act. Now, this one accelerates the idea that slavery is a moral issue that had been started during the Second Great Awakening, but most Americans weren't really privy to that idea. this one, considering the fact that the book is the most popular book in America in the 1800s, second only to the Bible, it's banned in the South, but it encourages people in the North to defy the Fugitive Slave Act. There are parts in the book that break story or break plot and talk directly to the reader, saying, if you have a soul, you will not let this continue to happen. So Harriet Beecher Stowe essentially argues that people should be battling against the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, here, obviously debates over slavery, but also differing cultures. The fact that Uncle Tom's Cabin is willing to be heard by the North, banned in the South, just goes to show you that we have growing cultural differences. Okay, so now fast forward a couple years and you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which will eventually lead into Bleeding Kansas. So the context here is the Missouri Compromise, which said that slavery is not going to be allowed in these territories, and the Compromise of 1850, which opens these ones up to popular sovereignty. Okay, so now we have a politician by the name of Stephen Douglas who comes along. He's from Illinois, and he says we need to build a railroad from Illinois to California because that'll open up markets with the Chinese and it'll help our economy. But you can't build a railroad through unorganized territory because there's nobody there really to pay for it, and the federal government's not big and or wealthy enough to foot the bill at this point. So you need to organize these territories. Well, you organize them by getting people out there, and what better way to get people out there than letting them bring their slaves? So he suggests opening Kansas and Nebraska to popular sovereignty, and in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he does. Now, this overturns the Missouri Compromise. It says compromises, but I assure you there was only one, which means to the people in the North that there's some sort of slave power conspiracy happening. Because if you're able to overturn the compromise from earlier on, that just goes to show you that anything can be overturned, and therefore nothing can be trusted. So it's a step towards people in the North really rallying for the complete annihilation of slavery. Now, this can obviously be categorized into debates over slavery and westward expansion, but nevertheless, it can't underscore this one enough, that it points to there being a slave power conspiracy. It will also give politicians the impetus for starting the Republican Party, which we will get to in a second. Now, initially, Kansas and Nebraska are open to popular sovereignty, but they never are able to have legitimate or legal elections because both sides constantly try to cheat. And so the only thing that comes of this is a bunch of fighting that will reach its climax in 1856 when John Brown kills 5 people at Pottawatomie Creek and cuts them up into itty-bitty pieces. That story never gets old. Fast forward 1 year and you have the infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857. The historical context behind this is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which of course undid the Missouri Compromise, which called into question what exactly is a free state and a slave state. So when Dred Scott, a slave from Missouri, is brought to Illinois and then to Minnesota, he says, hey, I'm in free states, I should be free now. And he sues his owners, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court because the lower courts can't make up their mind. And the Supreme Court, in an expedited decision, which means that they don't hear it like they do all other cases, determines that slaves are not citizens. Therefore, Dred Scott was not legally able to sue in the first place, and they should be considered property, which means that they can be taken anywhere in the United States that you can take property. So wherever you can take a horse, you can take your slave. Now, this one obviously does the whole doing away with blurred lines and says basically that slavery is allowed anywhere. There's no difference between a slave state and a free state as long as the property is gotten a hold of where it was legal in the first place. Now, this can obviously be categorized as debates over slavery or expansion. Same things over and over again. Now, things will eventually come to a violent point, which they kind of already did in Kansas, but John Brown's back. And in 1859, he wants to take over a federal arsenal, which is where they hold a bunch of weapons in Virginia, dangerously close to Washington, D.C. And he's hoping that a bunch of slaves will come and aid him in this insurrection. Now, unfortunately for him, the slaves don't ever show up, and he's captured and hung and sort of turned into a martyr for the North. It goes to show that the South will kill anybody who is anti-slave or anti-slavery, even though John Brown sort of, was trying to incite an insurrection. Nevertheless, heroic to incite an insurrection for what he was fighting against. Now, this one, again, I can't underscore this point enough, just goes to show you the failure of compromise. On an issue like slavery, compromise was never going to work. When something is that morally deep and people have that much invested in it and its outcomes, compromise is going to be a hard thing to do. So categorize this one under debates over slavery. And then finally, the straw that will break the camel's back is the election of 1860. Context behind this one is the birth of the Republican Party in 1854 in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then the Lincoln-Douglas debate, which bring Abraham Lincoln onto the national stage. They're debating for a Senate seat in Illinois. Abraham Lincoln loses, but everybody sort of recognizes him as the up-and-coming politician to take on the so-called slave power conspiracy. Lincoln's elected despite not carrying a single state in the South, and Southern states, South Carolina being the first one, react by seceding from the Union. And then shortly after, the states in the South, the deeper South you go, the earlier they secede, will go one by one by one. And then eventually in April 1861, we'll have a civil war on our hands. This one, political difference, economic debates over slavery, this sort of comes down to all of it. Even internal improvements is one of the things that Abraham Lincoln advocated for in his Republican Party platform in 1860. The South couldn't get on board with that one. But again, it really all comes down to slavery. So that's the lead up to the Civil War. And so now let's switch gears and ask a new question that encompasses the next two eras. Evaluate the extent to which the role of federal government changed between 1861 and 1877. Now, if I were to think about this and you were just to review this question, basically, hopefully you recognize that anytime there's a war in American history, the role of the federal government gets bigger. They do things during wars that they don't usually do in times of peace. And since there are three major wars that could possibly show up on your DBQ on the AP test, it's important to keep that in mind. So, for example, World War I, World War II, they both had rationing, they both had controlling of public dissent, they both instituted a selective service. So the role of the federal government gets bigger in any war that America fights in. Okay, so let's talk about politics during the Civil War. This is not going to talk about the battles. It won't talk about the uniforms, no guns, but just the politics. So as said before, the federal government expands its power. Lincoln very closely oversees the war effort. Early on, he suspends habeas corpus for some Union dissidents in Maryland, which means he throws them in jail without cause, even though he had a cause. But a lot of people have called him a dictator ever since. But more important, since the South is not voting in Congress, they're able to get things done that they wouldn't have been able to get done otherwise, namely the Pacific Railway Act, which lays the foundation for the Transcontinental Railroad to be built after the war is over, and then the Homestead Act, which gives away a lot of free land to populate the West. Those two things are wild expansions of the government's power, but just goes to show you what positive the government can have when not impeded by such conservative forces. Also, the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, where Lincoln basically takes it upon himself to free all the slaves in the Union. Remember, this doesn't free the slaves in areas of the Confederacy that are still in rebellion. It only frees the slaves in the Union. But still, finally, someone has taken a stance and done something to address the slavery question. And then this is all sort of cemented and memorialized in the Gettysburg Address, where he puts forth the idea that the government exists by the people, but it is also there for the people. So while the people give the government its power, the government has a mandate to look after and improve the lives of its constituents. Now, keeping that same theme of how does politics change, let's move on to Reconstruction. Now, recall that during presidential Reconstruction, which was overseen by Andrew Johnson, it was very lenient on Confederate states and allowed them back in quite easily because he wanted a quick restoration of the Union, but also wanted to empower poor Southern whites at the expense of freed slaves. So even though all the states had to acknowledge that slavery was over, they didn't really have to do anything other than that. And that's why a bunch of more radical Republicans come along and they impose military districts on the South, which is an expansion of federal power. They expand Black participation in politics just by making elections more safe. And with more Black Americans voting in the South, that's going to give us Black politicians in the South. But ultimately, Reconstruction was abandoned because the positive good that the government had been putting forth during the days of radical Reconstruction gave way to an economic depression in 1873. The trope that Blacks were uneducated and therefore were susceptible to corrupt governments only, even though they were just calling for some higher taxes, for some more social safety net. But, what are you going to do? Waning Northern resolve. The North was kind of growing impatient with it. They were sick of hearing about it. Kind of like what happened with the civil rights movement. Supreme Court decisions undercut the radical efforts, namely the Slaughterhouse cases and U.S. versus Cruikshank, if those ring a bell. And then, of course, the perpetual existence of sharecropping made it really difficult. Without a change to the economic forces, there was little chance that Reconstruction was going to really take on. Now, important expansions to the federal government's role that actually stuck were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So the 13th Amendment freed the slaves, the 14th Amendment gave them citizenship rights, and then the 15th Amendment obviously extended the right of suffrage to former male slaves. This angers American women, namely Susan B. Anthony, who gets into an epic fight with Frederick Douglass, saying, how can you see this as democratic? Because women still do not have the right to vote. They create organizations that are intended to ease the transition from slavery into American society by creating things like the Freedmen's Bureau, which of course is not rechartered by Andrew Johnson because he's just a stellar man. The military districts, which we already said, but that oversaw the voting process. So nevertheless, the government has increased its role during Reconstruction. Now, one example of how this is undone is with the KKK. So the KKK is at its height in a couple years after the war, but then President Ulysses S. Grant puts in place the Force Act, or the KKK Act, which uses federal troops and resources to completely dismantle the KKK. It's successful, and the KKK goes away in the 1870s. But then, of course, there are other white leagues and other type of paramilitary organizations that persist. And as a result of their persistence, they're not as open with their actions as the KKK was. They're able to sort of fight this guerrilla effort against Reconstruction, which succeeds. Now, the KKK obviously comes back in the 1920s, which just goes to show you that when the government is at its best, it's able to get rid of the KKK. When it's at its worst in the 1920s, the KKK comes back.